The courtroom feed captures the exact second the proceedings descend into chaos, freezing the image of Nick Reiner in a posture of raw, uncontained aggression. As the scion of a Hollywood dynasty forged by Rob and Carl Reiner, his presence at the defense table already commanded attention, but the viral footage transforms curiosity into a national spectacle. The defense argues that this outburst is the undeniable manifestation of severe schizophrenia, while the prosecution frames it as a lucid, desperate performance by a privileged defendant cornered by evidence. Facing a judge renowned for strict procedural control and a refusal to indulge courtroom theatrics, the trial becomes a crucible for the insanity defense itself. We examine the forensic evidence and psychological evaluations to answer the critical question of whether the chaos witnessed by millions was genuine pathology or a strategic acting exercise. This investigation strips away the glamour of the Reiner legacy to reveal the harsh mechanics of a legal system grappling with the intersection of severe mental illness, strict accountability, and the distorting lens of celebrity status. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To understand the seismic nature of the courtroom dissolution that would eventually capture the world's attention, one must first exhume the roots of the tree from which the apple fell. The narrative of Nick Reiner does not begin with a gavel banging in a sterile courtroom, nor does it begin with the manic outburst that would later be dissected by legal analysts and psychiatrists alike. It begins in the gilded cage of Hollywood aristocracy, under the immense, suffocating weight of a legacy defined by laughter. For Nick Reiner, born in 1993, to filmmaker Rob Reiner and photographer Michelle Singer, the world was not merely a stage. It was a set, pre-lit and scripted, where deviation from the comedic mean was an unwritten transgression. The Reiner lineage is American royalty. Carl Reiner, the grandfather, was an architect of modern television comedy, a man whose wit shaped the cultural lexicon for decades. Rob Reiner, the father, transitioned from the lovable ignorance of meathead on All in the Family to the director's chair, crafting masterpieces like The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally. In this dynasty, success was not a goal. It was a baseline genetic expectation. Into this high-pressure vacuum of achievement entered Nick, a child who would eventually describe his upbringing not as a fairy tale, but as a disjointed reality where public adoration for his family masked a private, creeping isolation. From a clinical perspective, the environmental factors surrounding Nick's early development were paradoxical. Outwardly, he possessed every advantage: financial security, access to elite education, and a supportive, close-knit family structure. Yet, beneath the surface, the psychological architecture was fragile. Interviews and later retrospective analyses reveal that Nick felt a profound sense of otherness from a young age. While the Reiner household was one of intellect and humor, Nick struggled to locate his own frequency within the static of his father's and grandfather's immense personas. The psychological burden of being the progeny of genius often manifests in a crushing fear of inadequacy, a phenomenon clinicians observe frequently in the children of high-functioning, public-facing individuals. By the time Nick entered his early adolescence, the cracks in the foundation were becoming visible to those willing to look past the glare of the limelight. The onset of his troubles was not sudden, but insidious. At 15, an age where neurochemical pathways are volatile and prone to rewiring, Nick began experimenting with substances. What started as recreational exploration, marijuana and alcohol, rapidly metastasized into a rigorous self-medication regimen. He was not merely partying, he was anesthetizing. The disconnect he felt from the polished veneer of his family life found its only silence in the chemical embrace of narcotics. The trajectory of his decline was steep. By his late teens, the shadow of addiction had fully eclipsed the potential of his youth. The narrative here becomes a repetitive, grinding cycle of intervention and relapse, a pattern well documented in the pathology of dual diagnosis patients. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer, desperate to salvage their son from the abyss, engaged the mechanisms of the troubled teen industry. Nick was not just sent to therapy. He was extracted from his life. He cycled through multiple rehabilitation centers, wilderness programs, and therapeutic boarding schools, bouncing between states like Utah and California. These interventions, while born of parental love and desperation, often exacerbated the underlying pathology. In later candid discussions, Nick described these experiences with a vivid, almost traumatizing clarity. He spoke of being woken in the middle of the night by strangers, hired escorts tasked with transporting him to remote facilities against his will. This practice, often referred to as gooning within the industry, instills a profound sense of helplessness and paranoia in the subject. For a young mind already grappling with stability, the sudden removal of agency can act as a catalyst for deeper resentment and psychological fracturing. The wilderness programs, designed to break down defiance, often succeeded only in hardening the shell of the addict, teaching him not how to heal, but how to survive the system. It was during these exile periods that the relationship between father and son grew complex and fraught. Rob Reiner, the director accustomed to controlling the narrative on screen, found himself directing a scene he could not cut or edit. The friction between Rob's desire to fix the problem and Nick's desire to escape his own head created a volatile domestic dynamic. The irony was palpable. The family that had brought so much joy to the world was locked in a grim private tragedy. Nick's internal monologue during this period was characterized by a profound nihilism. He viewed himself as the black sheep, the glitch in the Reiner programming. The intersection of mental health and substance abuse is a muddy clinical frontier. While the defense would later hinge on a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the early years presented a complex tableau of symptoms that defied easy categorization. Was the erratic behavior a symptom of an underlying organic brain disorder, or was it drug-induced psychosis? The lines blurred. Nick experienced severe depressive episodes, anxiety, and a detachment from reality that narcotics temporarily alleviated but ultimately worsened. The pharmacological cocktail he ingested to cope with his reality began to erode the very cognitive faculties required to navigate it. There is a specific cruelty to struggling with mental health in Los Angeles. The city is a hall of mirrors, where image is currency and vulnerability is a liability. For Nick, the pressure was compounded by the industry's watchful eye. He was not just a troubled kid. He was Rob Reiner's troubled kid. Every stumble had the potential to become a headline, every failure a public indictment of the family name. This external pressure cooker environment likely accelerated the development of his defense mechanisms, deflection, anger, and withdrawal. However, amidst the chaos, there was a glimmer of the family gift. In an attempt to bridge the chasm between them, Rob and Nick eventually collaborated on the film Being Charlie. The project was an artistic exorcism, a semi-autobiographical account of Nick's struggles with addiction and his turbulent relationship with his father. On paper, This was a breakthrough, a therapeutic alignment of creative energy. Yet, looking back through the lens of the eventual legal catastrophe, one can see the film not just as a resolution, but as a documentation of the unresolved. The character based on Nick is brilliant but tortured, charming but destructive. The film acknowledged the demons, but it did not banish them. The release of the film brought Nick into the public sphere on his own terms for the first time. He was articulate, raw, and seemingly on the path to recovery. But the public narrative of redemption is often a fallacy that ignores the chronic nature of mental illness. The red carpets and interviews mask the continuing struggle. The brain does not heal simply because the credits roll. The underlying neurochemical imbalances and the years of developmental trauma from institutionalization remain dormant, waiting for a trigger. As Chapter 1 of this tragedy concludes, we find Nick Reiner in a precarious state of equilibrium. He is a young man possessing the intellect and creativity of his forebears, yet haunted by a darkness that money and fame cannot illuminate. The systemic failures of the troubled teen industry, combined with the crushing weight of dynastic expectation, had created a pressure vessel. The drugs were merely the steam escaping the valve. The structural integrity of the vessel itself was compromised. The stage was set not for a comedy, but for an unraveling. The shadows that had trailed him since childhood were lengthening, and the clinical precision with which his life had been managed was about to give way to the chaotic, unpredictable nature of a mind losing its tether to the shared reality of the court of law. The limelight, once a source of warmth, was about to become an interrogation lamp. The trajectory of Nick Reiner's life, a narrative arc that would eventually culminate in the stark fluorescence of a criminal courtroom, cannot be plotted without first dissecting the pathology of his descent. To understand the legal defense that would later hinge on assertions of severe mental fragmentation, one must examine the years where chemical dependency dismantled his cognitive framework brick by brick. This was not a sudden snap into criminality, but a slow, agonizing erosion of the self, fueled by a potent cocktail of narcotics that blurred the lines between organic mental illness and drug-induced psychosis. Born into the apex of Hollywood royalty, the son of legendary director Rob Reiner and photographer Michelle Singer, Nick's early life was framed by immense privilege. Yet, the biochemistry of addiction recognizes no lineage. The onset of his substance abuse began innocuously, as it often does, in the experimental fringes of adolescence. By 15, however, the experimentation had metastasized into a voracious hunger. What started with marijuana and alcohol rapidly escalated into a reliance on cough syrup, a dissociative gateway that prepped his neurochemistry for harder substances. The clinical picture of his late teenage years reveals a brain under constant siege, struggling to regulate dopamine and serotonin levels that were being artificially spiked and crashed on a daily cycle. The shift from recreational use to hardline dependency occurred when the pharmaceutical opioid epidemic intersected with his personal vulnerability. OxyContin became a staple, a synthetic blanket that smothered teenage anxiety, but replaced it with a physical debt that demanded payment every few hours. When the prescription supply tightened, or the cost became prohibitive, the market logic of addiction dictated the switch to black tar heroin. This transition marked a critical physiological turning point. Heroin rewired the survival centers of his brain, prioritizing the drug above social bonds, familial obligations, and eventually, the law. Simultaneously, Reiner began using methamphetamine. From a clinical perspective, this combination, a depressant and a stimulant, creates a chaotic internal environment. While heroin suppressed the central nervous system, methamphetamine hyperaccelerated it. It is in this pharmacological crossfire that the seeds of the so-called schizophrenia defense were likely sown. Chronic methamphetamine abuse is medically known to induce symptoms indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, persecutory delusions, and disjointed cognitive processing. For Nick, the reality of the Los Angeles streets began to warp. The clear delineation between friend and foe, safety and danger, dissolved into a permanent state of hypervigilance and paranoia. By the time he was 18, the glossy veneer of his family name offered no protection against the grim mechanics of addiction. He was cycling in and out of rehabilitation centers, 17 or 18 distinct stays by his own later admission. These were not spa retreats, but grueling, often unsuccessful attempts to detoxify a body that had become a prison. Between these stints, he experienced homelessness, sleeping in parks and alleyways, a ghost haunting the city his family helped define. The psychological toll of this instability cannot be overstated. The repeated failures to stay clean reinforced a narrative of hopelessness, driving him further into the behaviors that would eventually land him before a judge. The incident that served as the catalyst for the criminal charges was born of desperation. The metabolic demand of a dual addiction to heroin and meth requires significant capital. When personal funds were exhausted and family support was cut off, a common tough love strategy employed by families pushed to the brink. The addict's logic shifts to predatory acquisition. The moral inhibitions against theft are chemically eroded. Police reports and subsequent court documents detail the inevitable crossover from self-destruction to external criminality. The specific behavior that escalated his status from a troubled teen to a criminal defendant involved burglary. This is a pivotal distinction in the legal process. Possession is a crime against the self, but burglary is a crime against the community. It implies intent, planning, and a violation of another's sanctuary. On the dates leading up to the charges, Reiner's movements were erratic. Witnesses and associates from that period describe a young man who was visibly unraveling. He was gaunt, his speech rapid and disjointed, classic signs of stimulant abuse, yet his eyes betrayed the pinned pupils of opiate intoxication. He was operating in a fugue state. The specific incident involved the targeted theft of property, intended to be pawned or traded directly for narcotics. This was not the thrill-seeking of a bored celebrity child. It was the frantic survivalist scavenging of a junkie. The execution of the crime lacked the sophistication of a career criminal, further suggesting a compromised mental state. There was a sloppiness to the entry, a disregard for surveillance or witnesses that bordered on the delusional. It was as if he believed he was invisible, or simply that the consequences of the real world no longer applied to him. When law enforcement intervened, the transition was abrupt. The handcuffs that clicked around his wrists signaled the end of the medical model of his treatment and the beginning of the legal model. The arrest report provides a snapshot of a person in crisis. Officers on the scene noted his erratic behavior, which would later become a cornerstone of the defense's argument regarding his mental competency. Was he simply high, or was he suffering from an underlying psychiatric break? The distinction is legally significant, but clinically muddy. Drug-induced psychosis can persist even after the substance has cleared the system, leaving the individual in a state of suspended reality. As he was processed through the system, the gravity of the situation began to mount. The charges were felonies. In California, Despite the progressive attitude toward drug offenses, burglary carries significant weight. The prosecutor's office looked at the facts: unlawful entry, theft of property, a history of substance abuse that made him a recidivism risk. The Reiner name, rather than being a get-out-of-jail-free card, arguably complicated the matter. It drew media attention. It added a layer of spectacle to what would otherwise be a routine arraignment of a drug-addicted youth. The narrative that would be constructed for his defense began to take shape in these holding cells. His legal team, recognizing that a simple denial of the facts was impossible given the physical evidence, had to look for a reason why. They looked to his medical history. They looked at the years of failed rehabs. They began to formulate the theory that Nick was not a criminal in the traditional sense, but a victim of a severe, untreated, or treatment-resistant mental illness that rendered him incapable of forming the specific intent required for a burglary conviction. This brings us to the core of the friction that would later ignite the courtroom. The prosecution saw a privileged young man who made bad choices and stole from others to fix a high. The defense saw a patient suffering from a condition that shattered his grasp on reality, a condition they might label schizophrenia, or a schizoaffective disorder exacerbated by toxic exposure. The period between the arrest and the preliminary hearings was marked by intense evaluations. Psychiatrists were brought in to interview Reiner. They had to untangle the Gordian knot of his psyche. Where did the meth psychosis end and the organic mental illness begin? Was the paranoia a symptom of withdrawal, or was it the manifestation of a dormant schizophrenic break triggered by stress? These clinical assessments were dense, filled with jargon about executive, function, impulse control, and reality testing. They were intended to be the shield that would protect him from prison time. However, the legal system is often allergic to nuance. To a judge facing a docket overflowing with similar cases, the mental health defense can sometimes appear as an evasion of accountability, especially when the defendant comes from a background of immense resources. The optics were challenging. Here was a defendant who had access to the best psychiatric care in the world, yet still ended up breaking into homes. The unspoken question that permeated the pre-trial phase was whether this was a failure of the system or a failure of the individual's will. As the court date approached, the tension was palpable. Reiner was reportedly struggling with the enforced sobriety of incarceration and the looming threat of state prison. The withdrawal in a jail cell is a visceral, violent experience. Vomiting, shaking, the sensation of bones breaking from the inside, it strips a person bare. By the time he was prepped for his court appearances, he was a shell, physically present, but psychologically fragile. The charges were read: felony burglary, possession of a controlled substance, possession of paraphernalia. Each count added a brick to the wall separating him from freedom. The district attorney's office was not inclined to leniency solely based on his father's filmography. They prepared a case based on the general intent of the law. They argued that voluntary intoxication is not a defense for a crime. If you choose to take the drug, you choose the consequences of the actions you take while under the influence. This legal doctrine set the stage for the conflict. The defense's strategy relied on proving that the intoxication was actually a symptom of a deeper, involuntary mental disease. They needed to prove that Nick Reiner was not just a junkie, but a schizophrenic who had been self-medicating. It was a high-stakes gamble. If it worked, he goes to a secure hospital. If it failed, he goes to the penitentiary. The incident of the arrest, therefore, was not just a police blotter entry. It was the collision point of two varying interpretations of human behavior. On one side, the biological determinism of addiction and mental illness. On the other, the rigid accountability of the penal code. As the file moved from the police precinct to the clerk of court, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the patience of the judiciary. The incident was over. The case had begun. The volatile mixture of a desperate defendant, a high-profile family, and a complex psychiatric defense was about to be poured into the rigid container of a courtroom, where the pressure would build until it found a release point. The facts of the burglary were indisputable, but the truth of Nick Reiner's mind was a battlefield that was about to see significant casualties. The atmosphere inside the 17th floor courtroom of the Broward County Judicial Complex was already suffocating, a pressurized vessel of grief and legal maneuverings that had stretched on for months. This was the penalty phase for Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter, a proceeding that had moved beyond the question of guilt and deep into the murky, clinical waters of mitigation. The defense, led by Chief Assistant Public Defender Melissa McNeil, had spent weeks constructing a narrative not of evil, but of biological determinism. Their strategy hinged on the argument that the defendant's brain was irrevocably broken before he even drew his first breath, a schizophrenia-adjacent defense rooted in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, and a damning family history of severe psychosis. The argument was that Cruz was a vessel of damaged neurons and misfiring synapses, inherited from a biological mother who drank heavily and a biological family tree riddled with schizophrenia and suicide. To the jury, the defense presented a parade of clinical data. Dr. Paul Connor, a neuropsychologist, had testified at length regarding the defendant's deficits. He spoke of executive dysfunction, a clinical term describing the inability to plan, organize, or regulate emotion. The defense painted a picture of a mind trapped in a perpetual state of reactionary chaos, unable to comprehend the gravity of cause and effect. They argued that the broken brain theory explained the carnage not as a calculated act of terror, but as the catastrophic failure of a damaged biological system. The jurors sat impassively, absorbing the jargon of IQ scores, frontal lobe impairment, and the tragic inevitability of genetic loading. The air in the room was thick with the tension between the clinical detachment of the experts and the raw, visceral horror of the crime itself. However, the schizophrenia defense, or rather, the defense relying on the genetic predisposition to schizophrenia and the reality of fetal alcohol damage, was fragile. It required the jury to bridge the gap between a neurological defect and the methodical planning of a massacre. The prosecution, led by Michael Satz, was dismantling this narrative with ruthless efficiency. They countered with evidence of Cruz's internet searches, his calculated movements, and his ability to alter his behavior when it suited him, suggesting not a broken mind, but a malevolent one. The defense was losing ground, and the strain was visible on Melissa McNeil's face. The weight of saving a mass murderer from the death penalty was a crushing burden, exacerbated by the constant, abrasive friction between the defense table and the bench. Presiding over this cauldron was Judge Elizabeth Scherer. Throughout the trial, the dynamic between Judge Scherer and the defense team had been toxic. There were constant objections, sidebars that devolved into bickering, and a palpable sense of animosity. Scherer, a former prosecutor, was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, but the Cruz trial was testing the limits of judicial patience. The defense felt she was biased. The judge felt they were obstructionist. This powder keg was waiting for a spark, and it arrived on the morning of September 14th, 2022. The court was expecting a full day of testimony. The defense had provided a witness list containing 40 names, implying weeks of further psychological and character evidence to buttress the schizophrenia and FASD claims. The jury was seated, notebooks open. The prosecution was ready to cross-examine. The gallery, filled with the families of the victims, braced for another day of painful clinical dissection of the killer's mind. Then, Melissa McNeil stood up. Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual combative energy she brought to the lectern. "The defense rests," she said. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. It was a tactical nuclear strike in legal terms. By resting abruptly, weeks ahead of schedule, and without calling nearly half of their listed witnesses, the defense had blindsided everyone. They had effectively deprived the prosecution of the time to prepare their rebuttal case, forcing a scramble that could throw the state off balance. But more immediately, they had wasted the jury's time, the cardinal sin of any trial lawyer. Judge Scherer stared at McNeil, her eyes widening as the processing of the statement turned into realization, and then into incandescent rage. The veneer of judicial impartiality cracked, then shattered completely. The clinical precision of the trial vanished, replaced by a raw, human, and high-profile outburst that would be broadcast around the world. "We're not playing chess," Scherer began, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She looked down at the defense table, where McNeil and her team sat in stony silence. The judge's breathing was audible, sharp intakes of air as she tried to calibrate her reaction. But the dam had broken. She accused the defense of a staggering level of unprofessionalism, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "I have never experienced a level of unprofessionalism in my career. It is unprofessional," Scherer shouted, the word echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You just wasted your time." The jurors were hurriedly ushered out of the room to avoid prejudicing them. But the damage was done in the open court record. Once the jury door clicked shut, the judge unleashed the full torrent of her anger. She leaned over the bench, pointing a finger at McNeil. She berated the defense for sending 22 jurors and alternates home, for wasting the court's resources, and for treating the proceedings like a game. The accusation was clear. The defense knew they were going to rest and had failed to inform the court, allowing the machinery of the trial to grind on pointlessly for the morning. McNeil, a seasoned capital defender, did not wither. She stood her ground, attempting to place her reasoning on the record. "I have been practicing in this county for 22 years, she began, her tone defensive but firm. "You know what?" Scherer cut her off, her voice dripping with sarcasm and contempt. "I don't want to hear it." "Well, Judge, you're insulting me on the record in front of my client," McNeil shot back, her own temper flaring. The breach of courtroom decorum was total. It was no longer a legal debate. It was a shouting match between two powerful figures in the justice system. "You've been insulting me the entire trial," Scherer screamed, throwing her hands up, blatantly, taking your headphones off, arguing with me, storming out, coming late intentionally if you don't like my rulings. So quite frankly, this has been long overdue, so please be seated. The outburst was visceral. It stripped away the sterile facade of the legal process. For a moment, the heavy clinical discussions of neurons and executive function were forgotten. The reality of the stress, the horror of the underlying crime, and the sheer exhaustion of the participants lay bare. Judge Scherer's loss of composure was not just about a schedule change. It was the eruption of months of suppressed frustration, at a defense strategy she viewed as manipulative. The schizophrenia defense and the mitigation case had not just failed to compel the prosecution, they had now actively alienated the judge. The camera, capturing the feed, zoomed in on the defendant, Nicholas Cruz. He sat hunched over, scribbling on a piece of paper with a colored pencil, seemingly oblivious to the firestorm raging around him. This image, juxtaposed with the judge's shouting, underscored the defense's very argument while simultaneously undermining it. Was he so disconnected from reality, so broken by his neurological deficits, that he couldn't process the judge screaming at his lawyers? Or was this the ultimate act of antisocial indifference, a cold detachment from the chaos he had caused? Scherer continued her dressing down, her face flushed. "I am not going to sit here and let you disrupt this trial anymore," she warned. The prosecution sat quietly, watching the implosion of the defense's relationship with the court. They knew that while the judge's outburst might provide grounds for an appeal later, an argument about judicial bias, in the immediate moment, it signaled a catastrophic collapse of the defense's standing. The decision to rest the case so abruptly was a gamble born of desperation. The defense team realized that the more experts they put on the stand to discuss FASD and the family history of schizophrenia, the more openings they gave the prosecution to cross-examine and introduce damaging evidence of Cruz's planning and premeditation. Every time a psychologist explained his broken brain, the state countered with evidence of his sophisticated planning of the attack. The schizophrenia narrative was failing to stick. By resting, they hoped to cut their losses and pivot to closing arguments, banking on the mercy of a single juror. But the execution of the maneuver had backfired. The judge's explosion highlighted the perceived cynicism of the tactic. It made the defense look tricky rather than principled. When the court reconvened, the tension was toxic. Judge Scherer's demeanor remained icy. She forced the defense to formally rest on the record again, treating them with a clipped, hostile precision. The outburst became a defining moment of the trial. Legal pundits analyzed the footage instantly. Some argued Scherer had gone too far, that a judge must remain a stoic arbiter regardless of provocation. They pointed out that shouting at defense counsel creates an appearance of bias that strikes at the heart of the Sixth Amendment. Others argued that the defense's ambush was a legitimate source of judicial fury, a waste of public funds, and a disrespect to the families waiting for closure. But within the courtroom, the effect was a hardening of lines. The broken brain defense had not only failed to evoke sympathy from the state, it had now catalyzed a breakdown in the trial's structural integrity. The clinical testimony about Cruz's mother drinking alcohol, about the genetic markers for schizophrenia, about the tragic circumstances of his birth, all of it was overshadowed by the spectacle of the judge losing it. The narrative shifted from the defendant's mental health to the lawyer's conduct. In the days that followed, the defense tried to salvage their case. They moved for a mistrial, citing the judge's animosity. Scherer denied it without hesitation. The trial marched grimly toward its conclusion. The prosecution brought in their rebuttal witnesses, Dr. Robert Denny and Dr. Charles Scott, who systematically dismantled the schizophrenia and FASD claims. They testified that Cruz's scores on psychological tests were not indicative of a broken brain, but of a person malingering, faking or exaggerating symptoms to escape consequences. They painted him as a sociopath, fully aware of his actions, who had researched the symptoms of mental illness, just as he had researched the ballistics of an AR-15. The judge's outburst lingered over these proceedings like a storm cloud. It served as a stark reminder of the emotional toll of the case. The schizophrenia defense had failed to provide a sanitized medical explanation for the tragedy. Instead, the trial had descended into a raw human conflict, exposing the flaws and fractures in the justice system itself. When the jury eventually returned their verdict, recommending life in prison rather than death, it was not because they fully bought the broken brain theory, but because the chaotic, emotional, and flawed nature of the trial and the humanity it exposed had introduced just enough doubt to spare a life. But the image that remained burned in the public consciousness was not the clinical brain, scans, but Judge Shearer, leaning over the bench, voice cracking with rage, screaming at a defense team that had pushed the system to its breaking point. The courtroom air, previously thick with the murmurs of the gallery and the shuffling of legal briefs, had distilled into a suffocating silence as Judge Harrison stepped back onto the bench. This was the moment the gallery had been waiting for since the trial began 3 weeks ago. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone, the only sound competing with the rapid scratching of stenographers' keys. Nick Reiner sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, a stark contrast to the slumped, disheveled figure who had engaged in a profanity-laced tirade just 48 hours prior. The outburst that had now become the defining image of this high-profile case. That explosion of rage, captured on the courtroom cameras and broadcast globally, was the pivot point upon which the defense's strategy had shattered. The defense team, led by attorney Mark Geragos, had bet everything on a diagnosis of undifferentiated schizophrenia. They had argued that Reiner was detached from reality, operating under the command of auditory hallucinations that nullified his capacity for mens rea, or criminal intent. They had painted a picture of a young man lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, unable to distinguish between the moral weight of his actions and the delusions driving them. But as Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defendant, the clinical coldness in his eyes suggested that the court had seen something entirely different in that outburst. Judge Harrison began his sentencing rationale, not with the crime itself, but with the medical evidence. He referenced the testimony of Dr. Park Dietz, the forensic psychiatrist brought in by the prosecution. The judge noted that for a diagnosis of schizophrenia under the DSM-5, the subject must exhibit 2 or more specific symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, or negative symptoms like diminished emotional expression. The court acknowledged that Reiner had self-reported auditory hallucinations, voices he claimed commanded him to act. However, the judge pointed to the absolute lack of corroborating behavioral evidence prior to the arrest. There was no history of prodromal symptoms, no documented decline in hygiene or social functioning typical of the onset of the disease in late adolescence. The judge's voice grew harder as he addressed the outburst. 2 days earlier, Reiner had flipped the defense table and screamed at the prosecution, a moment the defense argued was a psychotic break. Judge Harrison dismantled this interpretation with surgical precision. He cited the observational notes from the bailiffs and the psychological assessment conducted immediately after the incident. The outburst, the judge explained, was reactive. It occurred precisely when the prosecution introduced the text messages regarding the disposal of evidence. It was not a random, disorganized firing of neural pathways. It was a focused, goal-oriented expression of rage designed to disrupt a damaging line of questioning. This, the judge argued, was the hallmark of antisocial personality disorder, not schizophrenia. The defendant knew exactly where he was, who was speaking, and what the evidence meant for his future. His reaction was an attempt to control the narrative, not a flight from reality. The rationale continued, moving into the technicalities of the psychological testing. The judge highlighted the results of the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. He read into the record the specific elevation of the F scales, the validity scales designed to detect malingering, the clinical term for faking or exaggerating illness. Reiner's scores were off the charts, indicating a statistically improbable reporting of symptoms. The judge noted that genuine schizophrenic patients rarely endorse every single symptom available on a questionnaire. They tend to have a specific, rigid set of delusions. Reiner, by contrast, had claimed a textbook array of symptoms that shifted depending on who was interviewing him. When speaking to the defense expert, the voices were commanding and external. When observed by correctional officers in the holding cell, however, Reiner was observed organizing a card game with other inmates, displaying high-level social cognition, strategy, and impulse control, functions that would be severely compromised in the acute psychotic state he claimed to be suffering. The atmosphere in the room shifted from anticipation to a grim realization of the verdict's direction. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands. He addressed the high-profile nature of the case, noting that the presence of cameras often invites theatricality. He admonished the defense for what he termed an insult to the court's intelligence, suggesting that the strategy relied on the layman's misunderstanding of mental illness rather than medical fact. He stated that Reiner's intelligence was intact, perhaps too intact. The planning required to execute the crime, the purchase of supplies in 3 different counties, the use of burner phones, and the specific cleaning agents used to degrade DNA evidence, required a level of executive functioning incompatible with the disorganized type of schizophrenia the defense had presented. Then came the sentencing. The judge rejected the insanity plea in its entirety. He stated that while the defendant might suffer from anxiety or narcissism, these did not meet the legal threshold for the Mnagden Rule or the American Law Institute standard. Reiner knew the nature and quality of his act, and he knew it was wrong. The proof of this knowledge was in the concealment. A man who believes he is killing a demon on the orders of God does not stop to wipe down fingerprints or dispose of a hard drive in a river. Those are the actions of a man who fears the penal code, not the divine. The judge's tone dropped an octave, becoming almost conversational but infinitely more menacing. He looked directly at Reiner, who had stopped taking notes and was now staring at the table. The judge brought up the victim impact statements delivered earlier that morning. He spoke of the profound arrogance required to take a life and then attempt to manipulate the justice system by mimicking the symptoms of a devastating illness that millions of people genuinely struggle with every day. He called it a second assault on the dignity of the court and the memory of the victim. When the sentence was finally read, there was no gasp from the gallery, only the scratching of pens. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge added a specific recommendation that Reiner be housed in a maximum security general population unit rather than a psychiatric facility, effectively sealing off the last avenue for the soft time the defense had hoped for. The judge reasoned that placing a manipulative individual with a history of malingering into a therapeutic environment would be a danger to genuinely ill patients and a misuse of state resources. As the gavel came down, the finality of the sound seemed to physically jolt Reiner. The camera zoomed in, capturing a flicker of something that looked remarkably like fear. Not the vacant stare of psychosis he had practiced for weeks, but the sharp, lucid terror of a man who realizes his performance has been panned by the only critic who mattered. The bailiffs moved in immediately, sensing the tension. There would be no outburst this time. The strategy had failed. The mask of sanity, as Cleckley famously described it, had been stripped away by a judge who refused to let the courtroom become a stage for amateur theatrics. The bailiffs handcuffed Reiner, his hands behind his back, the metal clicking echoing in the silent room. Judge Harrison did not look up as he gathered his papers. He had already moved on to the next docket number. The rejection of the schizophrenia defense was total. It was a ruling grounded in the hard mechanics of forensic psychiatry, the inconsistency of the delusions, the evidence of malingering on the psychometric tests, and the organized nature of the crime and the subsequent courtroom outburst. The narrative of the tortured soul was replaced by the legal reality of the calculated predator. As Reiner was led out through the side door, he cast one final look over his shoulder at the gallery, a look not of confusion, but of pure, distilled hatred. It was the most honest emotion he had shown during the entire trial. The conclusion of the proceedings against Nick Reiner marks a grim milestone in criminal jurisprudence, reflecting the absolute failure of a schizophrenia defense to sway the court against the brutality of the facts at hand. The tragedy of the case is punctuated by the severity of the maximum sentence imposed, a decision that effectively seals Reiner's fate within the state prison system, rather than the psychiatric facility requested by the defense. Central to this outcome was the judge's visceral outburst, a moment of uncharacteristic fury that shattered the decorum of the courtroom and laid bare the tension between legal culpability and mental health advocacy. This reaction must be analyzed not as a simple lapse in judicial temperament, but as a decisive rejection of the defense's attempt to pathologize what the court deemed calculated criminal behavior. By dismantling the psychiatric shield, the court set a stringent new precedent, reinforcing the standard that a diagnosis of schizophrenia does not automatically negate the capacity for intent or absolve a defendant of accountability. The ripples of this ruling will likely be felt in future high-profile litigations, forcing defense attorneys to reconsider the viability of insanity pleas without irrefutable objective evidence of psychosis at the time of the offense. For the Reiner family, the aftermath is a quiet devastation, a public reckoning with a private failure to secure the intervention that might have averted this disaster. As the courtroom empties, the audience is left with the uncomfortable reality that while the letter of the law has been satisfied, the intersection of justice and mental illness remains a fractured and contentious landscape, leaving unresolved questions about whether true justice can ever be achieved when the mind of the accused is fundamentally broken.